cut my teeth on the civil rights, black power, and women's movement here as a young girl. And I became very involved in the Anti-Apartheid Movement, or the Southern African Liberation Movement, or the African Liberation Movement fairly early when I was in college and in graduate school. So I guess I can share more of my background if you want that, but I'll get right to my reading. So Vish asked me to talk about learning lessons from the Anti-Apartheid Solidarity Movement and movement building. And so what I've done is I want to start with a little history, because I'm not sure if people in other places, you all know the history before the 1960s and 70s. So if I could start first with a little bit of history, please bear with me, and then I'll get to some of my points of analysis in terms of the lessons. So first of all, international solidarity with the struggle of the people of South Africa dates back to the 19th century in the United States, and was primarily a black anti-colonial movement. It intensified with the founding of both the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in the United States in 1910 and the South African Native National Congress in 1912. Solomon Plaatje toured with his book, Native Life in South Africa, in New York and Chicago in 1921, and was hosted in the U.S. by the National Negro Press Association for that tour. Interestingly, in Chicago, he spoke in the same African Methodist Episcopal AME church and behind the same podium as both Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony had in the 19th century. The ties were strengthened with the founding of the Communist International, as communist parties were founded in both places and many places in the world. The Comintern was a ligature to struggles all over the world, and thus provided up-to-the-minute information on what was happening in South Africa. In 1937, the Harlem-based Council on African Affairs was started by Paul Robeson as a black left-centered organization in solidarity with anti-colonial struggles in Africa. They held the first U.S. bank boycott street demonstrations in support of the people of South Africa in the 1930s. What became increasingly known as the International Anti-Apartheid Movement was sparked by Sharpeville, Soweto, the killing of Steve Biko, and increasing numbers of South Africans living in exile in the United States. And of course, Tambo's leadership of the ANC's international mission. For many of us on the left, we were already involved in anti-imperialist work supporting liberation movements in Africa. For instance, a newsletter was published in Chicago and sent all over the world. It was called the African Agenda. I will never forget arriving in London in 1983 and finding my way to the office of Nkelelego Publications, and upon meeting Sonia Bunty and telling her I was from Chicago, she immediately asked if I knew the people who published this newsletter. For many of us, the South African liberation struggle was our primary political work. From 1980 to 1994, I was a lead organizer, and we worked with the ANC office at the United Nations in South Africa, and with South Africans that we knew, such as Lindiwe Mabuza, Dennis Brutus, and Willie Kokosile, to host South Africans and build movements. In Chicago and there were many organizations. One worked to organize religious folks, another was labor, another was students, for example. I often spoke at and on behalf of all of these. And although these were different organizations, we worked in coalition very well to some extent and built together. I often saw myself as a bridge builder between the organizations because when there were tensions, I seemed to be one of the ones that could bring them all together in ways that certain other folks could not. So I relished that role and thought it was an important one. So to some of the lessons, and this is, these are lessons, these are points. I'm not quite sure how you want to take them, but I think, in discussion, we could talk about what each of these things mean. I have about 11 points, but they're quick. The anti-apartheid movement in the United States was made up of hundreds of loosely connected location-based organizations formed in support of the struggle. So these are small organizations that could pop up anywhere, you know, middle of Iowa, Sacramento, New York, Albany, New York, Raleigh, North Carolina. There were organizations everywhere. And there were movements within professional organizations, unions, at colleges and universities as well. For instance, the Progressive Caucus of the National Library Association, I spoke to them once, and they began hosting literature about apartheid throughout the country. And then there was the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists that worked across unions like the UAW and the United Mine Workers organization here as well. And so these progressive caucuses or movements within broader organizations use their platforms to get the word out, to build solidarity within and across their organizations. Although the United States never had a national organization like in Great Britain, organizations did know about each other and worked together when they could. For instance, during the Springboks tour of 1981, the three cities that they were going to, New York City, and also Albany, New York, but New York City, Albany, New York, Chicago, and LA, we started the Stop the Apartheid Rugby Tour and really coordinated our activities very well between us. I was chair of the local Chicago group. I was in graduate school at Northwestern at the time, but it was the summer of after my first year, and I got involved. So point number 2, for U.S. Black Americans especially, the struggle in South Africa was a Pan-African moment. Like the Haitian Revolution and the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, the struggle in South Africa really, really spoke to the hearts of especially Black people in a way that, as I said, these only 2 other moments, I think, did so. And I've often wondered if such another moment is possible in these neoliberal, late capitalist times, and what will spark it. The international anti-apartheid struggle from the 1960s to 1994, this is point 3, I'm sorry. The international anti-apartheid struggle from the 1960s to 1994 deepened our experience here in this country as organizers and inspired regular folks towards an understanding of U.S. imperialism and racism as an international phenomenon, which I think was very, very important. The use of the Mandela couple as a metaphor for the separation of families and the horror of apartheid was particularly useful ANC propaganda. I thought it was, as I said, a particularly useful propaganda tool. Point number 5, the role of the SACP and AC publications were particularly useful. We were all subscribers to the AC and Sechava. We felt that the analysis was spot on and it kept us up to date as we were organizing on the ground here. Point number 6. However, after 94, after all the talks about talks and then the talks and the election of 1994, we were tremendously disappointed that South Africa did not nationalize big industries and create a mixed economy. I know you're probably saying, you know, you got a lot of nerve with a president like Trump. And it's true, we have not been able to do what we hoped you would do in your country. I often thought that South Africa could be a new locus. And given the comrades that we knew, we imagined at least a more mixed economy. We do know that the fall of the Soviet Union and the socialist world made it almost impossible to be totally socialist. But I always felt that Madiba had more moral capital than he spent. And there could have been more creative and targeted taxing to alleviate some of the poverty in the country. And now, you know, we have Black mining millionaires. So in many ways, the end of apartheid feels like a civil rights, a post-civil rights era in the United States. So the only difference, of course, is you have Black leadership, and even though we had a Black president, we've never had Black leadership. I often think people look at the United States as a model, and they should not. Number 7, I also remember being terribly disappointed that the ANC did not call for an international anti-imperialist gathering. I'm going to repeat this because I think this is a main analytical point. I remember being terribly disappointed that the ANC did not call for an international anti-imperialist gathering. There was no other movement in the world and no other moment so pregnant with such a possibility. South Africa could have been a leader in the world on this, and it would have generated continued solidarity and engagement with leaders all over the world. As you know, I mean, there were anti-apartheid movements in Japan and Sweden and every country in Africa and most countries in Western Europe. So I just thought we missed a major opportunity. Number 8, those who were sent to the South African consulates in the U.S. after '94 knew very little about the history of our movements and were told to work with business and not us. And it was terribly, disappointing. And it took me a few years to kind of soften my edge and then to be, asked to give money to the new South Africa after we had done all this work. When I knew that South Africa was a rich country, it just rubbed me the wrong way. I'll leave it there. But I understand. I do understand. But I think for a lot of people internationally, the fact that we weren't a part of some new international dispensation was challenging. Number 9. There were major ideological differences, of course, in the United States. The primary ones were between black cultural nationalists who supported the PAC and then broader groups that supported the ANC. However, there was also a lot of tension between left-leaning organizations and liberal ones. Some of our major liberal organizations were anti-communist. Because of anti-communism, many communists worked quietly in mass and community organizations. And because we were great organizers, we often rose in leadership. However, we were not open necessarily. And so what this means is that the role of the left tends to be hidden in these latter years. And then finally, there was a CP-led mass organization entitled the National Anti-Imperialist Movement in solidarity with African liberation. And it was part of coalitions in the big cities, but it never really grew like other organizations did. I used to always say maybe it was the title. But anyway, these are some of my points, and I hope they are useful to you. And I look forward to seeing people there in Joburg in October. Thanks, Vish. Bye.
And then Natalya. And can I ask everyone just to, if your phones are on, to turn them on silent, including the speakers? Okay, thanks. Do you have a PowerPoint?
No.
No, okay.
It's a Word document. I'm going to circulate it later.
Okay, thanks for the...
I'm going to attempt to do an analysis. And out of that analysis, I hope there'll be clear lessons that could be highlighted or disseminated. My generation of anti-apartheid activists is literally the last one, those born in the 70s. So we're the last children under apartheid, the last crop of activists to fight apartheid. And then we transcended to fight again post-apartheid. So we're in different movements. I was in the ANC and in the Communist Party. And the analysis that I'm going to do today is not the usual propagandist analysis or history narration that is done in the ANC, but rather is to reread the history. So I have 5 points. The heading is Anti-Apartheid International Solidarity Lessons for Renewing Internationalism. The first point is the post-war context, post-Second World War context. And the subheadings under there is hope, reaction, and progress. The second point is the West. The subheadings there are imperialism, ambivalence, and mass solidarity. The third point is the Soviet Union. The headings under that: material support and weak anti-capitalist outlook. Then I talk about, as the fourth point, non-aligned movement. I say revolutionary promise and capitulation. Then I conclude the world system crisis, social struggles, decadence, or revolutionary transformation. So I start. The anti-apartheid solidarity was forged on the global terrain of the world system of global capitalism that was shaped by the conditions and social and political forces that emerged after the Second World War up to 1994. So let's now go to each of the points that I highlighted earlier. First one, the post-war context, hope, reaction, and progress. The end of the Second World War in 1945 brought about hope for world peace, progressive transformation in social relations across the globe, between countries and within countries. In the global south, there was hope for an end to colonialism, apartheid, domination, and all forms of discrimination. In the global north, there was hope for improvement in the social conditions of workers, women, and other minority groups, even though the prospects for a socialist revolution had been crushed in the inter-war years. The establishment of the United Nations brought about relative peace and multilateralism in global governance, but in a contradictory way, power relations between countries of the global north and global south remain unequal, depicting imperialist relations. The ascendance of the US to the position of global hegemon, replacing UK, brought about the end of imperial rivalries of the pre-First World War and the inter-war period, instead ushered in an era of collective imperialism by powerful countries of the North led by the US. This also intensified Cold War. I'm saying intensified Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, and not necessarily inaugurated. Cold War actually started immediately after the end of the Russian Civil War in 1922. The post-war period was not just a Cold War rivalry between Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, as it is popularly written in mainstream academic literature and in the media, but rather there were four main blocs: the US and the West, including Japan, two, the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, three, China, four, the non-aligned movement. China was an important power bloc because it had a seat in the Security Council, but also its socialist tendencies sought to establish some independence from the Soviet Union, even before the Sino-Soviet tension broke out in the early 1960s. On the economic front, the post-war period revived and restructured global capitalism anew following the collapse of capital accumulation and the deep crisis during the Depression years of the interwar period, and ushering in the longest period from 1945 to the mid-70s of capitalist prosperity, the 30 years that are called the Golden Age in most literature. This period was spurred by the reconstruction following the destruction of the war in the West. So there was a lot of investment that was made in the reconstruction of the economies, and the vast demand of goods and services spurred the big expansion in terms of new industries such as automobile, housing, military industry, and so on. Now there were three main tendencies that were progressive politically, or rather the left tendencies. It was socialism, which was dominated by Soviet Union and the Maoist version, social democracy, and the National Liberation Movement. The post-war social democracy in Europe and in the US was a class compromise that sought to avert the socialist revolution, but still, that does not mean that it was not won out of serious struggles by the workers. So social wage was extended, and higher pay for workers, and jobs were guaranteed. To rush fast, in South Africa, we had the National Party that won elections in 1948 on an Afrikaner nationalism ticket. So it was a contrast of the hope. It had a very strong racism policy of apartheid, and in fact, their propaganda was that apartheid was a separate development, when it was actually a crude racist capitalist development of accumulation by whites and dispossessing blacks further. The Afrikaner capital was also promoted, and the status of the white working class as a labor aristocracy was affirmed. The Harold Wolff makes some insightful analysis on cheap labor in South Africa, because the majority of blacks were consigned to cheap labor. There was no black bourgeoisie, just a small middle class. Bennett Makubane as well provides some useful analysis in studying race, the political economy of race and class in the apartheid years. Sadly, we still lack on the left literature to clearly paint the picture of the post-1994 South African capitalism. So the struggle against apartheid became one of the most globalized national struggles in the post-war period. And the human rights culture, the sovereignty to nations that was promoted after the Second World War, sort of made the anti-apartheid movement to grow in different parts of the world. The dominant progressive, not left now, political traditions were the liberals, social democrats, national liberation movements, and the communists. And all of these were in the anti-apartheid movements in the West. Now, in the West, we had imperialism, ambivalence, and mass solidarity. Western governments initially supported apartheid because imperialism was tied to the minerals that South Africa was exporting to the world, and they did not have them. The US did not support sanctions until 1985. It openly called the liberation fighters and liberation movement terrorists. In Britain, the government there, particularly the Thatcher's conservative government from the 70s until 1990, openly sided with apartheid and they never implemented sanctions. But among the ordinary people in the West, there was a huge anti-apartheid movement in Britain, in many of those European countries. They were dominated by liberal, social democrats, trade unions, and communists. Around the Soviet Union, even though there was material support, I'm saying here the biggest, something big that was bestowed to the liberation movement or the communist movement in South Africa from the Soviet Union was not just Stalinism, but it was rather a weak anti-capitalist outlook. Remember, in the 60s, Soviet Union had a policy of peaceful coexistence with the West. It came from the Yalta deal that had been made between Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, that the Soviet Union will not expand socialist territories. So they did not open, the Soviet Union, on the contrary, did not openly promote a radical anti-capitalist outlooks or approaches. China, on the other hand, did. And it's interesting that today, all the countries that were tied to the Soviet Union in terms of building some de-linking projects are no longer around. They sort of collapsed with the Soviet Union. But the countries that sought to have some independence from the Soviet Union, such as China, Cuba, Vietnam, are still around pursuing some form of de-linking. I rush now on the non-aligned movement and focusing rather on Africa. To say, in Africa we had the Nyereres, Netos, Masheles, Kaundas, Nessars, Gaddafis and others who initially proposed and implemented radical development policies that sought to de-link from global capitalism. But they, sooner than later, capitulated, and Africa again was recolonized by finance capital through debt and structural adjustment programs. In South Africa, the liberation movement received enormous support from African governments, and at times at a big price, because these governments were attacked by the apartheid government, which was superior and strong militarily than these governments or countries. And apartheid, also working with the West, promoted wars in these countries. The picture that I've been trying to paint here is that solidarity after the Second World War up until 1994 was built on the terrain that obtained there and on the forces that were there. So today we are in a crisis. We have a crisis of the liberal establishment that is failing to hold. We have an economic crisis that is not going away. We have an ecological crisis that is getting worse and threatening the existence of humankind. It is on those terrains that we need to rebuild and renew solidarity. And that the initiative for me looks like is more in the countries of the South. Countries of the South must initiate movements for a meaningful transformation. But that meaningful transformation will not succeed if it does not link up with workers and the peoples of the North. So that's the kind of internationalism we need. And South Africa becomes an important center again, because South Africa is an expression or a macrocosm of global contradictions. You talk about class, you find them here, acute inequalities. You talk about race, you talk about xenophobia, you talk about all of these, you talk about gender, you talk about all of these problems we've been talking about here that are all over the world. You find them in South Africa in one territory, concentrated more than in any other country. Thank you.
Okay, we need skills.
But do you
Unless you
have
have skills.
connection for the Mac? Yeah.
You're as bad as me, Natalya.
The thing. So I've lost my actual PowerPoint, unfortunately. I'll just try to reconstruct it. So I'm going to talk about the anti-apartheid solidarity movement. And we'll look at a short history of the anti-apartheid movement, lessons learned, how the world has changed, and theoretical and practical issues for us today. So the anti-apartheid movement was a very loosely organized social movement for solidarity that became an international movement from Britain. It had simple aims, which were necessarily, I argue, reformist as opposed to revolutionary. Its strategy and programs were guided in the main by the African National Congress and its alliance partner, the South African Communist Party. The international solidarity was one of 4 pillars of struggle of the ANC. And I argue that the one pillar made the others possible and was only possible because of the others. So they couldn't exist in isolation. The others were mass mobilization, armed struggle, and underground work. So a short history of the struggle. From the late 1940s, in Britain and in Europe, there was a high anti-fascist sentiment amongst ordinary people of Europe immediately after the Second World War. And fascism was accepted by liberals and socialists as an evil to be vanquished. After the war, Britain built a strong trade union movement, and the workers' movements that had hard-won concessions, such as the National Health Service. But the 1950s also saw the Cold War take hold, and also there were, on the other side, anti-colonial struggles were afoot, with many national liberation struggles. And within them, there were nascent struggles between a nascent national bourgeoisie and socialists, within all these national liberation struggles across the world. In the late 40s, some South Africans moved to Britain because they were able to financially, mainly to pursue an education. They were mainly Indian and white comrades and some African comrades. Importantly, Tennyson Makawani came from the African National Congress. Amongst these people were communists, and because of the international principle of communists, it led them naturally to work with the Communist Party of Great Britain and naturally to work in solidarity with the British Labour Party. The importance of international support for South Africa's national liberation became clear, and these South Africans became involved in a committee of African organizations around 1958. Since 1907, can you give me time, please? 10 minutes, yeah? Oh, okay. 10, yeah. Since 1907, consumer boycotts have been a tool of struggle in South Africa and became especially prominent in the defiance campaigns of the 1950s. We took this tool into the international community, and the first call for an international consumer boycott was by the All Africa People's Conference held in Accra, the newly independent Ghana. And in London, they launched a major boycott of South African goods in 1959. From an ideological perspective, it was decided that all support should be welcomed and none excluded. They were looking for a broad front, and that the campaign should be seen as liberal with a small L issue and not in terms of party politics. This culminated in one of the largest mass demonstrations of the time in Britain in 1960, with an estimated 15,000 people marching. From the 1960s to the early 70s, the anti-apartheid movement took the struggle to the United Nations and pressurized governments for economic, military and diplomatic isolation. There were important international rulings of apartheid as a crime against humanity, and this undoubtedly assisted the struggle being waged on all fronts. Victories claimed by the anti-apartheid movement included that there was enough pressure to save the Rivonia trialists from hanging, and also there was large outrage generated during the Springbok tour of 1969. In the 1970s up to 1991, the anti-apartheid movement initiated campaigns for arms embargo, disinvestment, And this was in response to the crisis of capital in the early 70s. The early 70s saw the start of the Thatcher-Reagan axis, introducing Milton Friedman's free market capitalism and shock doctrine. And we also saw during that time the rise of racist and fascist political parties, for example, the British National Front. The anti-apartheid movement grew in the 80s from a small pressure group to a movement of many thousands of supporters, organising the biggest demonstrations Britain had yet seen, up to 250,000 people, from all over the country. It mobilised youth, it mobilised churches, workers and trade union movements. I had lovely pictures to show this. From all over Britain, political parties, community organisations. It spread across the world to America, Western Europe, India, and to a lesser extent in Africa. The Free Nelson Mandela campaign was an impressive global phenomenon. But we were also part of the solidarity movements for oppressed people throughout the world, and we saw our struggle in solidarity with SWAPO, Vietnam, and I remember participating in demonstrations against American invasion of Vietnam in the early 70s. And then the anti-apartheid movement towards the end of the 80s began mobilising in British black and ethnic minority and in working class communities. And that was really important for British left politics as well as for our struggle. They were also, I think, outstanding sacrifices, a step beyond solidarity, which were of immeasurable significance. This included the use of volunteers such as the London recruits, who were willing to risk their life or freedom in the name of internationalism. They, for me, were reminiscent of the heroes of the international brigades fighting fascism in Spain. And we need to look at that kind of solidarity as well. There was significant material assistance that were requested by the liberation movement that came from socialist countries, the frontline states who were very poor and under attack at the time, the Nordic governments, as well as ordinary working class people all over the world. And very importantly, Cuba was the only country in the world to provide direct military assistance to the struggle of Southern Africa. So what were the lessons learned? I think that its ability to mobilise broadly across the political spectrum and its ability to hold this alliance in the face of fierce anti-communism in the Cold War was very important. The ANC's leading and guidance, enabling clarity for the anti-apartheid movements across the world was absolutely key. And I think that's why, to some extent, Palestine hasn't been able to lock into international solidarity, because there hasn't been this very clear line of march coming from Palestine. Nations' democracies during this era were more functional, meaning people were effectively able to hold their governments to account. I think that's gone now. Trade unions were strong, as well as other left political groups, and there was generally, I think, a higher level of political consciousness amongst working class and middle class people. The inequality and absolute poverty was less than it was now in the global north, and people had more work security. And this affected their ability to get out on the streets and their ability to mobilise. The significant support from the socialist bloc enabled the armed struggle, even if it achieved only symbolic gains, or mainly symbolic gains, and it enabled direct work. And then really importantly, direct or horizontal links were very effective. For example, the National Union of Mine Workers in South Africa linking with the National Union of Mine Workers in Britain. The Dun shop workers, 4 women in Ireland, in striking solidarity with all shop workers and women in South Africa. It had a ripple effect going on. So what were the limitations? The broad alliance, as people have mentioned before, led to a strong influence by the neoliberal agenda. So that's one of the downsides of having a broad alliance, which the ANC was unable to resist post-1991. And importantly, I think for us today, is this movement took over 40 years to achieve the high levels of international mobilization that it did today. It wasn't in 10 minutes, or in a couple of weeks of mobilizing. So what's happening in the world today, and what lessons, how does this affect our mobilizing today? So for many people across the world, there's an erosion of national democracy. Countries have become oligarchies, autarchies, malfunctioning states, or kleptocracies. The ability for movements to influence policy or even raise accountability are becoming more and more rare. And so does this make the peaceful mass action, which was a hallmark of the anti-apartheid movement, ineffective? And I would argue that it would. I mean, one only has to look at the largest mass mobilization ever in Europe and the world against the war in Iraq in 2003, nothing. They were unable to achieve anything. The rise of corporate influence in the political sphere, are economic sanctions and consumer boycotts still, or would they still be of political value? Would they still impact the market? What kind of economic sanctions could or would be effective? The rise of the gig economy, the destruction of trade unions, is also making the workers less able to be mobilized in such an effective way, or the same way as before. And I think an important point is world system Marxists, including me, have generally delineated capitalist periods of accumulation in decades, accentuated by periods of crisis. But we have less than a decade before we face unimaginable global food, shelter and water crisis. So, something has to give. We can't look at these long periods. We cannot wait for capitalism to destroy the planet, which puts a spoke in the wheel of Marxist determinists as well, who'd rather wait until capitalism is a spent logic. We've got this problem now to deal with. We also need to look at the ideological vacuum in the left, the rise of fascism. So, arguing that capitalism is a globalized force today, we do need a global counter-movement. Unlike the anti-apartheid movement, I think this should be a political, radical and revolutionary movement in the sense that we cannot reform capitalism. So there are fundamental differences between the anti-apartheid struggle as well. So some theoretical and practical issues that might be a bit contentious. A socialist international, I argue, cannot be a broad alliance, including leftish, sort of liberalish people. But we should be able to make strategic short-term alliances with liberals, especially in India when fighting fascism. Liberals and left, we should be able to stand together when fighting fascism. And that's why the argument of what is fascism, where is fascism, is important. We should be able to make local and internationally strategic alliances with anti-racist, feminist, anti-ecocidal groups while maintaining an anti-capitalist stance. Our interactions with struggles of indigenous people, women, youth, gender non-binary people, smaller rights-based campaign should not detract from the fight of capitalism. But we need to develop an understanding as to how their struggles fit in a modern Marxist revolutionary practice, which we sort of failed to do. So I've been reading Red Rosa, which is, thanks to Kate Evans, the most amazing book, and I laughed and cried all the way through it. And here is a picture, because I said, unless we address the immediate, important or life-threatening concerns of the poor, they will continue to vote for the extreme right. And we need to figure out how we mobilize and relate. And the picture that I love here, there's Red Rosa with all her comrades toasting to the revolution in the new 20th century. And there's the maid looking at me like, oh God, more champagne. And I just really love this because there's this disconnect with Rosa saying comrades of toast and the worker in the corner going, bloody hell, what are they on about? So, the other thing that we've really got to do, okay, I'll come back to that. So Amin wrote in his last essays that the centre and periphery are not as they were. We need to explore this. There's such inequality in states that I think that we have centre and periphery and semi-periphery in one state, not sort of like globally delineated. And we need to reanalyze this because it will affect how we do our diagonal relationships, our direct relationships, our top-up, bottom-down relationships within a left front. We do not have the luxury of determinism. The house is on fire. We have no time. So the Luxemburg's writings we need to look at between the tension of historical determinism and the inevitable collapse of capitalism and the volunteerism of emancipatory action. I think we need to really sort of look hard at that. So in South Africa, to conclude, I think first we have to raise political consciousness amongst all our people. This isn't an intellectual exercise. We need to work at the grassroots. Political literacy is tied up, I believe, with basic literacy. We need to go out there. We need workers' schools, night schools, community radio and TV. We need to get, and here's Rosa Luxemburg saying 8 public meetings down, 6 more to go. As well as being an intellectual giant, she was there, and in a day, doing 14 public meetings. We can't just sit here and not have contact and not work with the people. Secondly, a contemporary socialist theory for an international is really, really important with all these points that I've made. And thirdly, a political program to fight fascism, stop wars, and more, and as important I think that Zelda was talking about in terms of humanity. We are facing violence on all different levels, micro-violence, macro-violence, and we need to discuss how we, in our everyday action, are non-violent, and that violence is the opposite of democracy. So, how many? 1 more minute. I would argue that a modern variant of the workers' demands for peace, bread and freedom, or peace, bread and land in the Soviet Union, is peace. No to fascism, yes to democracy. No to violence. Bread, because we need food. We need our planet to be able to produce food and water for all. And land, we must stop the destruction of our planet. So, in my last 30 seconds, because I'm a doctor, this is how to protect yourself from the coronavirus. You have to wash your hands well while singing the first verse and chorus of the red flag. So if you say the people's flag is deepest red, is shrouded up, and this is all, and that way, no coronavirus.
Excellent. Wonderful, both of all of you.